Church. We're glad to have you here this morning. Glad to be with you, worshiping with you, and seeking God and His Word with you this morning. This is week 10 of our study of Matthew's Gospel. Can you believe it? Some of you, I don't know, maybe you're tired of it yet. Have you gotten tired of it? Are you bored? I'm hoping not. Let me encourage you, if your answer is yes, probably you're more bored with me and not Jesus in God's Word. Because when we read Jesus and when we follow Him throughout Matthew's Gospel, He's anything but boring. He doesn't do boring. He's anything but that. And today what we're going to do is read through another of His great and mysterious miracles that He accomplished in His time on earth. And this is one of them that Bible students everywhere, and even our kids are familiar with this miracle. This is where Jesus walks on the water. And in one sense, when I come to a text like this, it's one of these stories where I'm afraid maybe it's become so familiar to us that it kind of loses its effect on us. It loses its punch because we're so used to hearing about it. We don't understand the extravagance of what Jesus is doing here. But the reality is that this miracle really happened. The things that we're going to read about and hear about today, this actually happened, and it has real meaning. Now, in another sense, while in one sense it may be so familiar we lose the meaning, I think this miracle in another sense is one that just, it excites us. We have a certain fascination with it. People think that this is a cool miracle, right? Not that they're not all cool, but this one in particular. People, show of hands, who has tried to imitate Jesus in walking on the water? I mean, you could, come on. I know you have. You went to a swimming pool and you kind of came back here and you took a run and you tried to take 2 or 3 steps across the water and you failed miserably and you saw how hard it actually is. And some of you probably had a friend with a camera ready so that when you get that first step on there, it looked like you were standing on the water. Now everyone's going to go home and try it. Not today, it's too cold, but try it. It's fun. This seems to me like one of these miracles that just, it captures our imagination about Jesus. And I think when we look at it, it may mystify us a bit, but there is a deep and clear meaning for us today. It's pretty amazing that Jesus did this in this story, and that we'll find that Peter, one of his disciples, even took a few steps on top of the water as well. And there are lessons to learn. There are so many lessons to learn in this text. And the reality is, I felt like I could have preached it 2 or 3 or 4 times to get all the meaning. But I think there's a deep takeaway for us today found within the text, and we're going to find that as we study Matthew's gospel. I want you to hear the text this morning.
Immediately, he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. After he dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. And when evening came, he was there alone. But the boat by this time was a long, long way from land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. And in the 4th watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, and they said, "It is a ghost," and they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." And Peter answered him and said, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." And so he said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." And Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, "Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. And those in the boat worshiped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God."
You know, a song like this is exciting to sing. I mean, this whole worship set this morning, it just moved me to a different place. But this last song, it's everything that I truly want to think and feel. Do you know what I mean? When everything else is out of the way, this is exactly how I want to express myself to the Lord. It says, "Your love so deep, it's washing over me. Your face, it's all I seek. Nothing else. You're my everything. Jesus Christ, you're my one desire. Lord, hear my only cry to know you all my life, my only desire, my only pursuit. And there are times in life when that's easier than others. There are times when it's easy to express that with my voice and with my decisions and with my life. And then there are times that I have to work at it a lot harder. And often those times when I'm finding I'm really having to work to express that honestly to God, those are the times where the chaos of life steals my focus. It moves my attention away from God, where forces that seem bigger than me, forces that seem stronger than me, leave me feeling helpless and afraid. How many of you this morning, you think you've experienced a storm, like a real storm in your life, whether it be emotional or financial or spiritual or relational? You know, there are storms that rage our lives every day. That's reality. And the winds of your storm, the winds might be the pressures of a job or the lack of a job, or it might be schoolwork or any work that you really feel like you just can't get a handle on. It's bigger than you, and it's exhausting you, and it's weighing you down. And the pouring rains of your storm might be a million different things. It might be relationships or finances that are falling or that are failing. And then there are these surprises that come, these things we didn't expect, like thunder in the night that shakes us, right? It booms and we literally shake because it catches us off guard and it stirs fear in our soul. Even though we're not afraid of the thunder, it shakes us to our core. There are things like this in our life, and what I'm describing isn't the unusual, it's not the abnormal, it's not the exception, but this is just life, isn't it? The question is, for you and I today, how are we to face the storms in this life? They come. They're inevitable. They're a part of the regular living on this earth. But how do we survive them? How do we survive the storm? And that's what our text this morning deals with. The event that we're looking at today, it exposes the emotional fears and the spiritual uncertainty that Jesus' disciples experience when they're faced with a literal storm. And in our timeline in Matthew's gospel, as we've been tracking from the beginning of it, we've actually jumped back just a little bit, you'll notice. Last week we were in Matthew chapter 15 dealing with a hard saying of Jesus, a difficult text, but in that we learned a lesson that the disciples were learning about great faith in Jesus and what great faith looks like. And then 2 weeks ago, we were in Matthew chapter 14, right before the text we're looking at today. It was the miracle of Jesus feeding the 5,000 men plus a bunch of 10 to 15,000 people using just a couple of fish and a few pieces of bread. And that's where the story picks up today. It's immediately following the feeding story in Matthew chapter 14. Jesus had taken these 5 loaves of barley bread and these 2 fish, and he multiplied it, and he fed thousands with it. And everyone in the room, everywhere ate until they were completely satisfied, until they were stuffed, until their bellies hurt. And there were still 12 baskets of leftovers. And John's account of that story of the feeding miracle right there, it adds something to it that we don't see in Matthew. There's a detail that he includes. And the detail is at the end of that feeding, the crowds begin to emerge on Jesus. They begin to kind of rush towards him and push towards him. And they're wishing to take him by force to make him their king. Kind of seems like a little bit of an awkward thing that they're coming by force to elevate him, not to beat him down. But you can kind of understand it if you think about it. Jesus is generous and he's powerful and he's wise and he's good to them, and people love it. And so why wouldn't they want him in charge? Why wouldn't they want him doling out his generosity and his wisdom over them? But Jesus knew that it wasn't his time to rule. It wasn't the way his leadership would come. And so in Matthew chapter 14 and verse 22, it tells us that immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side. Now, presumably he did this to make sure that they didn't get caught up and swept up in the emotion of what was going on, because they might have been eager and excited by the crowd saying, "Make him our king," and so they might have tried to join in at the same time and elevate Jesus as king. And so Jesus sent them on ahead while he stayed behind and sent the crowds away. Verse 23, after he sent the crowds away, he went up on a mountain by himself to pray. And when it was evening, notice the timestamp here, when it was evening, we'll come back to that, he was there praying alone on the mountain. So Jesus had sent his disciples out by boat to travel to a place where they would meet up later, and he goes alone to pray, to spend time talking with his Father in heaven. And I think about Jesus' prayers because he does this often. He goes and spends alone time with God praying, and I wonder what he prayed about so often because it's very unlike my prayers probably. I pray a lot for forgiveness, and Jesus was perfect and never sinned, and so there's not, Father in heaven, forgive me. He didn't need to do that. And there's so many things in my life where I don't know what decision to take, what the next step is, but Jesus is in perfect communion with the Father, and so he knows the Father's will, and so I don't think he's anguishing over what am I supposed to do. He's clear on his mission at all times. And so he's not praying for forgiveness, he's not asking what happens next. So I started thinking about what Jesus and his Father talk about, and I wonder, what kinds of things do you talk about with people that you love dearly? Think about it for a sec. Well, you reminisce about the past. You think about, the good times that you've had together, and you talk about common interests, the things that you share and both are interested in. You get excited about it together, and then you dream about the future together of what could be and should be and will be, right? I think this is what Jesus and the Father are talking about on the mountain. They're reminiscing of times gone by before Jesus had come to earth, when Jesus was in heaven, and they're just in full glory together, and they're talking about the good days, right? And now they're talking about, with common interest, the peace and the justice that they want to see take place on the earth. And then they begin to look ahead to the time, the right time, when Jesus would rule over the earth as king. It's not now, but it's coming. And so they talk about it and they dream about it together, about what a day it will be when Jesus rules over the earth. So the disciples, in the meantime, while Jesus is spending time nourishing his relationship with the Father in heaven, the disciples obey Jesus, and they get in the boat and they take off and they begin to travel. They begin to row from Bethsaida, which remember, that's where the feeding miracle took place, and they're heading to a place called Gennesaret. I almost said Gennesaret. Gennesaret. And this is, we see in verse 34 of chapter 14. But I want you to see something here. There's a picture. This is a satellite photo of the Sea of Galilee. Bottom's cut off just a little bit. It looks kind of like a harp. Looks a little bit to me kind of like the continent of Africa. But what I want you to see is this really isn't that big. It's not, you think the sea, this is more like a lake. It's 13 miles or so tall and about 8 miles or so wide. And this body of water was the center of the bulk of Jesus' ministry. Most of the things that we read about Jesus doing took place just all around this body of water. And when you see them on the water, usually they're just kind of crossing back and forth and moving around between spots around the Sea of Galilee. And in decent weather, if you were to go across, like from this Magdala and Kersey place, it's about a 3-hour road trip in the kind of boat and the kind of travel they were doing. So call it a 3-hour tour if it was good weather, going from east to west. We know how those 3-hour tours end up, don't we? If you'll notice here at the top, you find Bethsaida. That's where the feeding miracle took place. And just a tiny bit to the south and west, still at the top, right? What do you see? Gennesaret. It's right there. So they're not really going from top to bottom or far east to west. They're not traveling very far. This is a very short trip. They probably could have just as easily walked around the coast. I mean, just a few miles. That would have been very reasonable. But we remember that at least 4 of these guys, at least 4 of the disciples, were fishermen by trade. They grew up on these waters. They were always on these waters. They're probably more comfortable with sea legs than on the ground. And so it was very natural for them just to hop in the boat and run across the water. Now, these waters, they were kind of home for them. But I want you to see this. I asked you to remember the timestamp. When did they take off from Bethsaida? It was evening. After all had eaten, and Jesus had sent the disciples away and gone to pray, the text says it was evening. Now look at verse 24. The boat was already a long distance from land, battered by the waves, for the wind was contrary. It opposed them, is the language. It was fundamentally against them, is the language describing that. So they took off from the shore, and in the time that they took off from Bethsaida, a great storm just kind of swelled up over them. Now, I don't imagine that this storm had begun before they took off. Maybe it was a little misty or something like that. But if there was a horrible storm, they probably wouldn't have gotten in the boat. Does that seem reasonable? They probably would have said, well, let's wait for better weather. Come on, Jesus, or we'll walk around. That's our better idea. So it seems like probably it was a reasonable idea for them to hop in the boat and take off on this little trip along the coastline. But we find this storm has swelled up over them, and it's been thrashing them. And what we find in just a second is that they've been out there for hours, fighting with all of their strength, the wind and the waves, until the fourth watch of the night. And that's somewhere between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. So evening, you watching your clock hand move around, to about dawn. So they're exhausted, right? Emotionally and physically, they haven't been able to cross this short distance all night long because of this storm. And I don't mean to over-spiritualize the situation. I don't think that we should do that, but I think that it makes sense in the context of what Matthew's trying to express in this story, that the same thing can happen in our life sometimes. That we can be going along and everything's fine, we're headed where we're going, wherever it is, and then suddenly, without warning, storms can attack us, chaos, things we didn't expect. We were on a simple path, and now everything's gotten very, very difficult for us. Now, it's not always this way, but sometimes it is. And here, this is what's happened. Can you imagine with me how the disciples might have felt at this point? These guys are very confident on these waters, and they took off. And now their arms are exhausted, their shoulders are hurting, their backs are struggling, they're soaked to the bone as they've been attacked by surprise by this storm. So they've been out there maybe 6 to 9, maybe more hours, pushing with all of their strength against the waves, fighting with all of their might, using all the knowledge of the sea that they have from years of fishing on the body of water, and they're just not getting anywhere. It's like on a water treadmill. They're just staying in the same spot, and they're stuck. They're stuck in the storm. They're tired, exhausted. I think it's possible that their faith even was shaken in this moment. Because here they are following Jesus. They've left everything behind to follow Jesus. They feel that they've been chosen for something very unique, something very special, a special task. And now, without seeing that task completed, without seeing the benefits of the life's work that they were putting in, they think that they may die at sea. They are in trouble. And here's an incredible truth for us to be reminded of, found here next, and that's that Jesus knows. He knows when his disciples are in trouble. Look at verse 25. In the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking, walking on top of the sea. Now, we're used to hearing this. We're familiar with the story. We've all heard Jesus walked on the water. But imagine the first time that people started hearing this story, when the disciples, they landed on the shore and they started running to family and friends and telling them about what took place. Or maybe they're telling someone and trying to convince them to put their trust in Jesus. Imagine what Matthew's original readers, when he first wrote this gospel, thought when they saw these words, in the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. They think this is ridiculous. They think that they're crazy people, right? This kind of thing doesn't happen. It's unbelievable. It's unreasonable that in this storm that has defeated a whole team of very experienced rowers, Jesus just kind of casually walks up, strolling unaffected by the storm, walking on top of the water. He's not wading out in it. Try to picture this. This is exactly what Jesus did. Now, before we get into what happens next, I want to make another point of connection for us. And the various kinds of storms that we find ourselves in, whether they're relational or financial or emotional or spiritual, I think that we can often get disoriented in the middle of the storm and wonder how we got here. What did I do to end up in this situation? What wrong turn did I make? And I don't know what the disciples were thinking here. Maybe they're thinking something like this. Maybe they had forgotten why they were out there in the water and all of this. But we saw it clearly in verse 22, right? Why were they out there? Verse 22 says that Jesus made them. Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side. In this case here, Jesus sent them through the storm. Just because Jesus' disciples face difficulties doesn't mean that Jesus hadn't sent them there. Do you hear that? Sometimes he sends us into the storm to perfect us, and sometimes to discipline us. But the fact is, he made them go. We see that in verse 22. I think I may see a couple of reasons why he did so. I don't think Jesus is being cruel to them. I don't think that he's punishing them for something. I don't think he's toying with them and kind of, putting them out there and saying, hey, look what I can do. I don't think that's what's going on here. I think there is a purposeful intent for why Jesus sent them into the storm. And the first thing I see is that he's removing them from a dangerous situation. It may not have seemed like a dangerous situation to them, but remember, the crowds are converging on Jesus. And they could have had two responses. Maybe they would have joined in with the crowds, and then they would have stepped outside the will of God by trying to force Jesus to be king. And so he's protecting them from that. He's removing them from that situation. Or maybe they would have taken up defensive positions around Jesus. As the crowds came to converge on Jesus, they may have stood around him and started a riot fighting against the crowds. But for some reason, Jesus says, I need to remove them from the situation so I can handle things as they should be handled. And he sends them away into the boat so he can send the crowds away. That's one reason I think he sent them into the storm. But the second is I think that he's teaching them something vital that they haven't learned yet. And this doesn't mean that Jesus sends us into every storm that we face. I need you to hear that. Jesus doesn't send us into every storm that we face, but sometimes he does. And when he does, there's always a purpose. And it's always for our good and for his glory. Now, Mark's gospel adds a pretty cool detail here in Mark 6:48 to this story. Jesus is up on the mountain, and he's praying with the Father. Then the disciples are out in the boat, and they're fighting all night in the storms. And Mark says that Jesus looked, and he saw the disciples straining at the oars. You catch this? He saw them straining at the oars from miles away up on the mountain in the middle of the storm. Okay, so I don't think Mark is saying that Jesus just saw with natural eyes. I don't think that you or I would sit there. Even at that distance, we might see a speck. But in the storm, physically, we couldn't see them out there straining at the oars. And so I think that Mark is making a point here. Mark is making a point that Jesus doesn't look just with physical eyes, but he's God. And as such, he sees everything that's going on. However far the disciples would travel, whatever they went through and wherever they would go, Jesus was aware of their situation and their need, and that's because Jesus is God. Proverbs 15:3 says, the eyes of the Lord, they're in every place watching all the time. If you're familiar with Psalm 139, it talks about how God knows us, every detail within us. He knows our heart. He knows every condition that we experience. And he cares for us. Jesus, sitting on the mountain, looks and he sees his friends, his followers, his disciples. They're straining. They're in trouble. All right, so let's come back to the middle of the Sea of Galilee, where the disciples are in this storm, where they're fighting in this storm. Jesus goes out to them. He's walking on top of the lake. And at this sight, when they see the form of Jesus walking towards them, they're soaked to the bone. They're totally exhausted. And they see the figure of Jesus walking out to them. And verse 26 says, when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified. And they said, it's a ghost. They're scared. And they begin to cry out in fear. Now, this seems to me, and it may seem to you, a little bit of a ridiculous response because they should have known better. They've seen Jesus do all kinds of miracles. And in fact, in Matthew chapter 8, they were all in a very similar situation together, out on the sea, in a boat, in a storm. And in that story, Jesus is asleep in the boat, and they're in this horrible storm, and they cry out, Lord, save us. And Jesus steps out, and the text says that he rebuked the winds. That means he reprimanded the winds. He scolded the storm. He said, you behave. And the storm calmed, and the sea was still just at Jesus' words. And so they should have known better. This time, Jesus isn't in the boat, and their panic leads them to disbelief when they see the figure of Jesus moving towards them. They simply can't imagine how they could have been gone for this long and Jesus could have caught up with them, just strolling along casually through the storm on top of the water that they've been fighting all night. They should have known better. But Jesus, when he shows up, he doesn't call them ridiculous. He doesn't scold them. This is what he says in verse 27. Immediately, Jesus spoke up to them saying, Take courage. It is I. Do not be afraid. And church, I think this is the key to this text. I think this is the centerpiece of this passage, of this story in Jesus' life and in the disciples' life. He says, take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid. And this phrase, it is I, is actually the same wording that Jesus uses quite a bit in talking with the disciples and in his ministry. It's a combination of words that means I am. Jesus said things in other places like, I am the way and the truth and the life. He said, I am the vine and you are the branches. He said, I am the good shepherd. He said, I am the door. Jesus said, I am the bread of life. And he even said, when talking with some Pharisees, he said, before Abraham was born, this is 41 long-lived generations back from Jesus. Before Abraham was born, I am. I have always been. I am that I am. In each of these instances, Jesus is revealing a unique aspect of who he was. And in every one of these statements, he's indicating that he, Jesus, is the eternal incarnate God. He's not just a prophet. He's not just a smart guy. He's not just a teacher. He's not just a magic man. He's not just a leader. He's not just someone to be admired, but he's the incarnate God. He's equating himself with the I am, the title that God had given himself when speaking to Moses in Exodus 3:14. Jesus says, do not be afraid. I am that I am, and I am here. And he says this out to the disciples at sea. He could have said a lot of things. He could have walked up and said, hey, I'm here. He could have said, hey, what's up, guys? How's it going? He could have said, it's really me. Look. But what he said is, ego eimi, I am. Do not be afraid. That's because Jesus wanted them to know something about himself, something that they had not yet clicked into. They had not yet really understood or grasped this. That Jesus is the living God come to earth. That's the point of this passage. That is the Christ-centered point of this passage. It's the main reason I think that Matthew included this event in his gospel. It's so that Matthew's readers could understand and believe that I am is with us in the storm. You hear that? That's what Matthew's point is. He wants us to know that God is with us in the storm. And that's a theme that we see throughout the scriptures. In the Old Testament, God charged Joshua with it. He said, be strong and courageous. Don't tremble. Don't be dismayed. Don't fret. Don't worry. Don't be beat up by the storms in life. For the Lord your God is with you. He's with you wherever you go. And Jesus continued this message while he was on earth, and he finished his great commission to his disciples by saying, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. And he explained how that would take place. He said, even when I go away, the Father in heaven will send you a helper. That's God, the Holy Spirit. He will help you. He will guide you. He will be with you. He will empower you in all things. God is with us in whatever storms we face. That's gospel truth. That's what we see in this text. We are not alone. The wind and waves, they're coming down on us in our life. He says, do not fear. Do not fear. I am with you. It's the comfort that a child receives in a tornado when he feels his father's hands on him, protecting him, giving him encouragement, or a mother's embrace, expressing love. Sometimes the Lord calms the storm. Sometimes he calms his children in the middle of the storm. I'm going to take a jump in the text. I'm going to move to verse 32, and I want to explain to you why I'm going to do that before I do. There's this incredible passage that we all are excited about Peter walking on the water. And we get excited because we go, okay, now this wasn't Jesus. This was a normal person, and they're doing something pretty amazing. And if Peter can do it, I'm going to try the swimming pool thing again. And so we think this is the central point of the text. And I tell you, there's an incredible sermon someday that I hope to preach here about Peter walking on the water, because there's a lot to be learned about about trusting in the empowerment of God to do things beyond yourself and waiting on Jesus to take that leap of faith until he says, yes, this is the right step for you. There's a lot of powerful meaning in that. But our series is, it's all about Jesus. That's what this series is called. And what I see in this text from a Christ-centered perspective is that this is talking about Jesus being the Son of God. And so I'm going to skip to verse 32, and I hope you'll forgive me for that. We'll address the other another time. This next moment that we're going to look at, it's an incredible moment where Jesus exhibits the divine power that he has. He is not just a miracle man. He's not just a magic man, but he has full authority over all of the elements. Look at verse 32. When they got into the boat, this is Peter and Jesus. When they got into the boat, the wind stopped. I mean, he didn't have to say anything. He didn't wave his hands. There was no hocus pocus, no fairy dust. He just got into the boat, and immediately the wind stopped. And John's gospel adds something that's even more mysterious. It says that immediately the boat was at the land at which they were going to. Catch that? So Jesus gets in the boat and everything is made right immediately. He has full control over everything. That just seems impossible. It seems unimaginable and unreasonable unless we believe what the Bible says, that Jesus is God and was in the beginning. John 1:3 says, all things came into being through him, through Jesus. And apart from him, nothing came into being that has ever come into being. So if Jesus created everything, if he is God, if he was in the beginning, taking part in all of the creative activity in the beginnings of Genesis chapter 1, then he created all of the elements, the water and the wind and the meteorological conditions that lead to a storm. And so it's simple logic. If he created all of this, if he thought it up, if it exists because of him, then he is over it. He supersedes it. He cannot be constrained by it. That's because he's God. Mark adds another interesting observation. In Mark chapter 6, verse 52, and in verse 51, it says that he got into the boat, same thing as Matthew says, and the wind stopped. And it says that the disciples were utterly astonished, for they had not gained any insight from the incident of the loaves, but their heart was hardened. Yeah, wow. Imagine seeing what they have seen. Imagine seeing what they had just seen. I mean, just hours ago, Jesus had fed 10 to 15,000 people with just a couple of fish and a few pieces of bread, and they gained nothing from this. I mean, it's likely that the leftovers, the 12 baskets of leftovers from that miracle are with them on the boat. They're a reminder to them of who Jesus is and what Jesus is able to do, and they gain no insights from them. Here they are. They're just hours from Jesus doing something that no one imaginably could do. And here in front of them is that same Jesus that performed that same feeding miracle, and they had not gained enough insight to translate what they had learned or should have learned into this situation. They are astonished. They are fearful. And I must, in response to this text, and I think that we all should do this, we should examine our hearts to see if we've failed to gain insight from God's unique work in our lives. Whenever we face a new crisis or a new chaos or a new storm, so often what's our response? So often our response is to go into panic, to go into worry mode, into stress out mode, to go into what am I going to do mode? Or we pick up our arms and we stand up and we straighten our belt and throw back our shoulders and we say, I can get this. And we fight in our own strength and with our own knowledge to fight back against any chaos in our life, instead of immediately turning to Jesus, who has always proven himself faithful, always ready, always more than capable of handling anything in our life. And he's always with us. He promises that forever to the end of the age. I am such a slow learner. We can be such slow learners. Do you wonder why this finally clicked for the disciples? It seems like they finally are starting to understand something about Jesus here. And I think we see it here. It may be because this is the first miracle that we know of that Jesus did that is just for the disciples. You catch that? mean, he had been feeding and he had been healing and he had been casting out demons, and the disciples witnessed all of this. But this is the first time that it's just them and Jesus. They're out there alone. It's in the middle of the storm. No one can see this. No one else is the focus of attention. It's just the disciples and Jesus, and he's doing this miracle just for them. I think that when God does something that's just for us, it does something special to help increase our faith in him. I'll tell you a quick story. Our family's just experienced something like this in just the recent couple of weeks. We've been here almost 5 months now, and we've been house shopping as long as we've been here. And it's been a struggle because we have really sought to be good stewards of the money that God has entrusted to us and be good stewards of the geography of the area that God has placed us in which to do ministry. And so we have worried and we have stressed over where do we live and what house do we buy. And it's been taxing. It's been emotionally just a battle for us, and we've tried to fight through it, and we've tried to honor him in our decision. And just a few weeks back, by the way, we closed on our house Friday, so we're about to move in. But just a few weeks back, we had made an offer on a house on a Saturday. On the Thursday before, some of you know I've got a local restaurant right down the street that I'm at as a regular all the time. And on the Thursday before we made an offer on the house, the owner of the restaurant, who I've built a relationship with, he came over here to try to find me and tell me that one of his other regulars was about to sell his house. And he thought it fit, we'd talked about it. He said, "This may be what you're looking for." Well, I wasn't in my office at the time, so he just left a message with somebody saying, "Hey, let Kevin know I've got someone he needs to talk to about a house, and I want to put them together." Well, I didn't get the message before we made an offer on a house. And so we made an offer. The offer was accepted. We're going to get this house. And so about a week later, I'm in the restaurant again, and Sean comes up to me and says, "Hey, you're not going to believe this. I had left you a message about a guy wanting to sell a house, and I thought it might be a good fit." Well, he was in the other day, and we started talking, and we put two and two together, and we realized that you're the one who bought his house. I'm not the guy who says, "Well, everything, Jesus did it all." He tied my shoelace and kept it tied all day. But I tell you what, that was so affirming to our family. It was affirming in the house buying process that we were doing the right thing. It was also affirming just in our calling to be here and be in God's will here at Legacy Church. And he didn't have to do that. He didn't have to give us this funny little story that we can tell about purchasing our house. But I believe he did, and it did something special in my soul, just to stretch and increase my faith in him, that he is in charge, and that when I trust him, he has everything managed for me. For the disciples, finally, out in the middle of the Sea of Galilee in the early dawn, in the wake of the storm, something clicked for them. The light came on, and they moved from beyond amazement concerning Jesus to true worship for Jesus. Verse 33. And those who were in the boat worshiped him, saying, "You certainly, truly are God's Son." It may be that they use more words than this. It's possible that they said, "We've been kind of starting to figure this out. The things that you've said and the things you've done, we were kind of coming to this conclusion. I think we might have gotten there eventually, but now there's no doubt in our mind who you are. I am is with us in the storm." We all have those kind of moments, don't we? This is the first time, the very first time that the disciples have worshiped Jesus as the Son of God. Can you believe it? We're at the end of chapter 14 of Matthew's Gospel. We've covered a lot of ground, and we've even had to miss some stuff in our hurry to get to Easter, right? This is the first time the disciples have fallen down and really seen Jesus for who he is, the Son of God. And they worship him, and Jesus accepts their worship because that's exactly who he is. And so now our question is this: what difference does a story like this make? A miracle like this, what kind of difference should it make to our lives? And there's a couple of responses that I think that we can have. I think there's a couple of ways that this story can encourage and challenge us. And the first is this: if you have never recognized Jesus for who he is, if you have never seen him as God come to earth to establish God's kingdom and to save sinners, among which I and every one of us are included, let me encourage you today to see him in this way. and to ask him, as Peter does in verse 30, as he began to sink under the waves in his storm, Lord, save me. And if you have placed your trust in Jesus, if you have come to depend on him, this miracle was designed to generate and increase the faith of the disciples of Jesus as more than a prophet, more than a teacher, more than a moral compass, more than a guy to go to from time to time when you're not sure what's going on, more than just a lifeline when you're almost drowning, but as God who is always with you, who's always watching, who always cares what's going on in your life, and he's always more than capable in the storm. So let this miracle stretch your faith muscles. Let it stretch your trust muscles so that whenever a storm comes up, whenever your next storm starts, and maybe you're in it now, maybe you're in the middle of a storm now and you feel like you're drowning. You're tired, you're exhausted, you've given up hope. Maybe it's personal, it's financial, it's emotional, it's spiritual, it's relational. I want you to say to yourself these things. Maybe you get up in the morning and look in the mirror and say this so that you can hear it. Say, Jesus is aware of my situation. He's aware of my situation. He is capable to protect me in the storm. He's more than capable. And he cares for me. He really does. His word promises it. And Jesus will provide peace and protection when I trust in him rather than lose my head in the storm. Let's pray. Lord, I pray that you would calm our storms. And if not yet, not now, would you give us peace in the middle of the storm? Would you give us peace so that we would trust in you, so that we could fall on our feet and from our feet and we could worship you? Because that is our heart's desire. It's our one desire. Amen.